She was 22 years old and had nothing left but a canvas satchel, a splitting axe with a cracked ash handle wrapped in twine, and $11 in coins that clinked against each other every time she shifted the bag on her shoulder. No family, no address, no plan that extended past the next town on the road north. And with those $11, every cent she had in the world, she bought a forgotten logging cabin and the 40 acres of spruce and birch surrounding it, somewhere in the backwoods of northern Ontario, that hadn't seen a living soul in 9 years. But what nobody knew, what she herself would not discover until the second week of frost, was that beneath the floorboards of the cabin's cold cellar, someone had left something behind. Not by accident, by design, and what was written on the paper folded inside it would change the entire course of her life. If you've found your way to Cabin Stories, we're glad you're here. This one is worth hearing all the way through. Her name was Delia Marsh, though everyone who mattered to her had always called her just Delia, and she was born in the early spring of 1891 in a narrow frame house at the edge of a mill town called Renfrew, Ontario, the youngest of 4 children, and the only one who never seemed entirely at home indoors. Her father, Harold Marsh, ran a small saw filing operation out of a lean-to behind the house, keeping the blades of the local mill sharp for a flat monthly fee that was never quite enough and was sometimes paid late. He was not a large man, but he was a careful one. He moved through his work the way a good craftsman always does, without hurry, without waste. And the millwrights trusted him because he understood that a dull blade doesn't just slow production. It makes the work dangerous. Her mother, Vera, had been a schoolteacher before she married and kept teaching informally after, in the sense that she could not help explaining things she found interesting to whoever happened to be nearby, which was most often Delia. Delia grew up understanding that in their house, work was not something separate from life. It was the texture of it. You woke, you lit the stove, you went to the lean-to and listened to the high, clean ring of a file on a cross-cut blade, and then you came back inside and ate and learned and slept and started again. Her brothers, Edmund, Lewis, and the eldest, Douglas, drifted naturally toward the mill itself, toward the noise and the money and the particular swagger of men who worked with heavy machinery. Delia drifted toward the lean-to and her father's tools. By the time she was 12, Harold Marsh let her handle the files herself on the smaller gang saws. By 14, she could read the bevel on a blade the way a musician reads a note, instinctively, by feel, and adjust her angle without being told. By 16, she could true a bent saw plate with a hammer and a block of hardwood in a way that made the millwrights bring their work to the lean-to and wait. Her father did not make a ceremony of any of this. He simply moved over a few inches and let her stand beside him. In the Marsh household, that was the highest form of acknowledgement there was. The winter she turned 17, Harold gave her his best hand axe. The handle was ash, worn smooth where his palm had gripped it for 20 years, and the head was a hewing axe, not a splitting axe, ground to a single bevel with a hollow on the flat side so clean it could shave paper. He told her it had been made by a blacksmith in Pembroke who had since died, and that you couldn't buy that quality anymore, and that the only honest thing about a well-made axe was that it never pretended to be something it wasn't. It cut, or it didn't. She kept it wrapped in a piece of canvas in the bottom of her satchel from that day forward, and she never used it without thinking of his hands. Harold Marsh died in the January of 1908 of a pneumonia that started as a cough he ignored for too long and became something the doctor in Renfrew could not turn back. He was 53. Delia was 17. Her mother, Vera, who had always been bright and purposeful and privately fierce, became quieter after that. Not lost exactly, but compressed, as though grief had reduced something in her that had once taken up more space. Within a year, she remarried. The man's name was Clifton Albury, a land surveyor from Pembroke who had come to Renfrew for a contract and had recognized in Vera a capable woman who would manage his household well and ask very little for herself. He was not unkind. He was something harder to name than unkind. He was indifferent, in the particular way of a man who has decided that the people around him are either useful or inconvenient, and Delia was, in his estimation, the latter. He did not object to the lean-to work openly. He objected to it sideways, in the manner of a man who understood that direct confrontation was unnecessary when quiet erosion would serve just as well. He allowed the saw filing contracts to lapse without renewal. He sold the filing equipment to a man in Arnprior for less than it was worth. He suggested, with the polished reasonableness of someone who had learned to package his preferences as common sense, that a young woman of Delia's age ought to be thinking about domestic work in town, or perhaps a position in a shop, something befitting her situation. Delia's brothers were already gone. Edmund to the CPR, Lewis to a mine near Sudbury, Douglas married and settled in Sault Ste. Marie. Each departure had felt like a small door closing. By the time Delia was 19, it was just her and Vera and Clifton Albury in a house that smelled of his pipe and the particular stillness of rooms where no one spoke freely. The woman who shaped Delia most deeply, apart from her father, was not her mother. It was a woman named Bess Quinnell, who lived alone in a log house at the end of a two-track road outside Renfrew, and who had been, at various points in her 64 years, a farmhand, a trapper, a log scaler for a timber company, and a healer of the practical sort, the kind that sets bones and draws poultices and asks no questions about how the injury happened. Bess had been married once, briefly in her 20s, and had never spoken of it except once to Delia, while they were processing a deer together in the shed behind the log house. She said only that some arrangements teach you more about yourself in their ending than they ever did in their continuation, and that she considered herself well educated. Delia had found her way to Bess at 13, following a trail she'd heard about from a boy at school who said the old woman in the woods could identify any bird by its call and any tree by its bark, which struck Delia as exactly the kind of knowledge worth having. She knocked on the door, and Bess Quinnell opened it, looked at her without particular surprise, and said, "I wondered when someone your age would come around who actually wanted to learn something. Come in." Delia came back twice a week for 7 years. Bess taught her how timber grows, and how it falls, and what a healthy stand of forest sounds like when the wind moves through it, versus one that's diseased. She taught her to read terrain, to know by the lie of the land where water collects, where frost lingers, where the soil will hold a root, and where it will not. She taught her to fell a tree cleanly, to notch and hinge so it fell exactly where you put it, and to limb and buck without waste, the way a good cook takes apart a chicken so that nothing is lost. She taught her to read the rings in a stump the way other people read a face. She taught her to build a fire in wet wood, to tap a maple, to keep a tool sharp and a wound clean and a cook fire going in a February wind. Bess had never owned land herself. She told Delia once, skinning a rabbit by the stove while snow tapped against the window, that a woman without land was a woman who lived entirely by the goodwill of others, and that goodwill, no matter how sincerely offered, was not the same as security. She said it without bitterness. It was simply a fact she had lived with long enough to be certain of. Bess Quinnell died in the autumn of 1912, in her sleep, in the log house at the end of the two-track road, with a cup of cold tea on the floor beside her cot and the stove burned down to ash. She left Delia a small canvas-covered notebook filled with plant and tree identifications, forestry notes, and the occasional remark that was so direct it felt like being looked at steadily by someone who refused to look away. She left her the skinning knife and the broad-head chisel she'd used for joinery since 1880, and she left her a single piece of advice written on the inside cover of the notebook in handwriting that slanted hard to the left, as though it was leaning into a wind. What you know how to do cannot be taken from you. A deed can be lost, a purse can be stolen, a name can be stripped away. Skill stays. Delia carried that notebook in her satchel alongside her father's axe, and together they were the whole of her inheritance. Not money, not property, not a name that meant anything to a bank or a court, but knowledge pressed into the shape of things she could hold in her hands. The morning Delia was turned out was a Wednesday in March of 1913. The snow was still thick on the ground, but there was a softness in the air that meant it would begin to go. Soon, the particular quality of late winter light that feels like a rumor of something warmer. She had spent the previous day at Bess's old log house, which she still visited to maintain, keeping the roof cleared, the mice out of the walls, the small kindnesses of continued attention to a place that had mattered. She had come home past dark, later than Clifton Albury considered proper, which was itself a judgment she had learned to navigate carefully. She had not argued. She had walked past him, hung up her coat, and gone to her room. She heard his voice through the wall, measured and low, speaking to her mother. She could not make out the words. She did not need to. In the morning, when she came downstairs, her satchel was sitting on the front step, packed, her clothes, her blanket, her father's axe, Bess's notebook and knives. The door was latched from inside. A note was tucked under the satchel's buckle, written in Clifton Albury's accountant's hand on a small sheet of his letterhead. It read, "Delia. After considerable discussion, your mother and I are in agreement that it would be best for all concerned if you were to establish your own situation going forward. This is not a decision made lightly. Enclosed you will find $11 to assist your immediate circumstances. We wish you well. C. Alberry. The $11 were in a paper envelope folded under the note. Delia stood on the step for a long time, reading the note twice, then folding it along its original creases and placing it in her coat pocket. She did not knock on the door. She did not call her mother's name. She looked at the house, the porch rail her father had built, the window where her mother used to put a lamp on winter evenings so the light would be visible from the road, and she felt something close in her chest, like a drawer being pushed shut. She picked up her satchel, settled it on her back, and walked down the step and out the gate and north, toward the road. She was 22 years old. She had $11, a wool blanket, a hewing axe, a pocket knife, a field notebook, and the clothes on her back. She walked north because she had always meant to go north, and because Bess Quinnell had told her once that the country north of the French River was the kind of land that didn't ask you questions about where you'd come from. It simply asked what you could do. And because she had read in Bess's notebook, in an entry from the summer of 1899, that the mixed forest country above Georgian Bay was among the most sustaining land in the province. Clean water, game, timber, soil that would grow root crops if you persuaded it patiently. She walked for 4 days. The first night she slept in a hay barn outside Eganville, with her satchel as a pillow, and her blanket pulled up to her ears, listening to the horses breathe in their stalls on the other side of the wall, which was, she found, a surprisingly comforting sound. The second night she slept under a railway bridge above a creek that was beginning to run fast with snowmelt, and the sound of the water all night was like something persistent and purposeful that did not stop. The third day she hitched a ride on a freight wagon, going toward the town of Mattawa. The driver, an older man transporting pine boards to a mill, did not ask her any questions which she appreciated, and she did not offer any information which he seemed to appreciate in return. The fourth day she arrived in a place called Carver's Landing, which was not much more than a general store, a livery, a bush telegraph office, and a collection of houses and outbuildings arranged without obvious plan around a crossroads. The store was run by a man named Olin Pickett, who was past 60. With a face that had been weathered to the color of old cedar and a manner of absolute stillness that suggested he had long ago stopped being surprised by anything that came through his door. Delia bought a pound of dried beans, a tin of tea, and a slab of salt pork with $1.40 from her 11, and asked if there was work in the area for someone who could file blades and fell timber and do rough joinery. Olin Pickett studied her for a moment. Her hands, which were calloused in the places that mattered, her boots, which were worn but greased, her eyes, which did not move away from his when she spoke. Then he said, "Depends on what you're willing to live in." She told him she was willing to live in anything with 4 walls and a roof that mostly held. He nodded slowly and said there was a bush camp property about 6 miles north along the creek road that had been sitting empty since a logging operation pulled out in 1904, and the county had been trying to clear the title for years. The cabin and its 40 acres had been listed for $11, which was not the value of the place, but the cost of the county being rid of a piece of paper it didn't want to manage anymore. The property had been part of a white spruce and birch operation owned before the war by a timber merchant named Aldous Vance, who had built the main cabin himself in 1888 as a camp headquarters, and who had, according to local knowledge, finished it better than most men would bother to finish a permanent home, let alone a logging camp. The cabin was built of dovetail-notched spruce logs, full scribe fit with no gaps at the corners, the kind of work that takes patience most people don't have. The roof had been good cedar, and a portion of it had come down on the south side. 9 years of snow load without anyone to clear it, taking part of the interior wall with it. The floor was split cedar planks, and on the collapsed side, frost heave and water damage had rotted 6 of them through, but the north side of the cabin was intact. The walls were solid. The stone chimney at the west end stood straight, mortared with a mix that had set like iron, and the firebox was wide enough to take a 4-foot log and would draw, clean. She could see that at a glance from the ash pattern and the lack of staining above the lintel. There was a cold cellar accessed through a trap door in the cabin floor, dug into the permafrost beneath the foundation, lined with flat shale set on edge and covered with a plank door that had warped but not rotted. There was a lean-to shed attached to the north wall, its framing still square, its roof intact. There was a spring-fed creek 50 feet from the door that ran clean and cold even now, at the tail end of winter, and a cleared half-acre that had once been a kitchen garden, now overgrown with alder brush and raspberry cane, but with dark soil beneath that you could smell from the edge of the clearing. Delia walked the property for 2 hours. She pressed her palms against the log walls and felt the solidity of them. She tested each floor plank with her boot heel, cataloging what held and what gave. She climbed what remained of the roof framing on the north side and looked at the rafters, which were hand-hewn spruce and still sound. She looked at the chimney from all 4 sides, and she walked the tree line, reading the age and health of the timber, looking for what had been cut over, and what had grown back, and what had been left untouched. What she saw was not what most people would have seen. Most people would have seen a ruin. Delia saw bones. The logs were old-growth spruce, denser and more durable than anything cut in the last 30 years. The chimney was plumb. The spring ran clear. The garden soil was deep and black. The lean-to shed was dry inside and had a workbench along the north wall that was still level. And the surrounding forest was healthy mixed timber. Birch, spruce, balsam, a few large white pine that had been missed by the loggers, which meant the soil was good and the drainage sound. She went back to Olin Pickett's store that same afternoon and told him she wanted to buy it. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she was already becoming familiar with. Not quite doubt, not quite admiration, but the specific look of someone who has lived long enough to know better than to predict what a determined person will do. He opened the county ledger, wrote the transfer on a half sheet of paper, and Delia laid $11 on the counter. $11. The exact sum Clifton Albury had enclosed in her eviction note. The amount he had calculated as the value of sending her away cleanly, with his conscience intact. And she pressed every cent of it down flat on Olin Pickett's counter and signed her name, and the property was hers. 40 acres of boreal forest, and a half-built cabin north of Georgian Bay, a spring creek, a collapsed roof, a cold cellar she had not yet opened, and $11 worth of a life. She had decided she was going to build herself. She carried her satchel up the creek road in the late afternoon light, and let herself in through the cabin door that hung from one leather hinge, and she set her satchel down on the north side of the cedar floor, and stood there in the silence. The wind moved through the gap in the south wall with a sound like breathing. The creek ran over stones outside, and she thought, this is mine, not permitted, not lent, not conditional on anyone's goodwill or patience, bought with the last money she had. The same money that was meant to close a door has just opened one. She lived in the north half of the cabin for the first 2 weeks, sleeping rolled in her blanket with her satchel against her back, burning small fires each evening to take the edge off the cold. She cleared debris by day, rotted planks, fallen bark, the accumulated 9 years of a building left to its own devices, and she stacked what could be burned and sorted what could not, and began to understand the shape of what she had. On the 12th day, she turned her attention to the cold cellar. She had been putting it off without quite admitting to herself that she was putting it off. There was something about the trapdoor, its deliberate construction, the care with which the plank cover had been fitted into the frame, that gave her the feeling that whatever was in that cellar had been placed there with intention. She got her broadhead chisel from the satchel, worked the edge under the warped cover, and lifted it with a sound like a held breath being released. The cold cellar was properly built. Shale walls, a packed earth floor, cold and dry, which was why everything in it had been preserved. There were 2 clay crocks on a low shelf, still sealed with wax and linen. There were 3 coils of good rope, and at the back of the cellar, set apart from the other things and wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with cord, was something the size of a large book, or a small box, or the weight of something that had been left with deliberate care. Delia carried it up to the light. She set it on the workbench in the lean-to and unwrapped it slowly. The way you open something you suspect matters. Inside the oilcloth were 3 things. The first was a tin cash box, the old kind with a hinged lid and a simple clasp. She opened it and found inside a row of coins. Not silver but gold. Dominion of Canada $10 gold pieces, the old Maple Leads sovereigns, 8 of them, set in a row on a folded piece of chamois. $80 in gold. More money than her father had earned in a year of saw filing. More money than she had held in her life, in total and at once. She sat down on the workbench stool and looked at them for a long time. The second thing was a small wooden case, the size of a man's hand, made of birch, with a sliding dovetail lid, and carved along the top with a simple pattern of spruce branches, the kind of carving done during the long evenings of a bush camp winter by someone who needed something to do with their hands. She slid the lid open. Inside, resting on a piece of flannel, was a compass. Not a plain surveyor's compass, but a beautiful one. the needle housed in a brass bezel engraved on the underside, with initials she could not quite make out. The face marked in degrees in a hand, so fine it must have been done with an engraver's tool. It was the kind of instrument made to last generations, the kind passed from teacher to student, or parent to child, or between two people who trusted each other entirely. She held it in her palm and felt it settle, the needle swinging and then stilling to true north, reliable as a heartbeat. The third thing was a letter, folded into thirds, sealed with a wax stamp that had hardened to amber. She broke it and unfolded the paper, which was heavy and had not yellowed, and read it in the clear northern light coming through the lean-to's open side. My name is Aldous Vance, and I am writing this on the 2nd of November, 1903, at the table in this cabin that I built with my own hands in the summer of 1888. I am 60 years old, and I am closing this operation, though not for the reasons I would have chosen. My partner, who is a man I will not name here because I would not have his name in this document beside mine, has filed papers that give him claim to most of what we built together, and the lawyers in Toronto have agreed with him, for reasons that have more to do with the length of his purse than the merit of his case. I have fought it as long as I have money to fight it, and the money is gone. I am leaving this camp and this land to whatever happens next, because I cannot take it with me, and I will not let them have it. The coins in the tin box are the last of what I earned in 15 years of timber work that I am proud of, set aside in the years before the dispute, when I still believed that honest work was its own protection. I have learned that it is not, entirely, but I believe it is still worth doing. The compass was made for me by a Cree man named Joseph Makwa, who worked with me in the camp from 1891 to 1898, and who could read this forest the way other men read a newspaper. He made it from brass fittings he had saved from another life, and he engraved my initials on the bezel himself with a tool he carried in his shirt pocket. He said the compass would always point true north, but that it was up to me to decide what I was walking toward. He was wiser than most people I have met. I am putting these things here because the cold cellar is the driest and most hidden place in this building, and because a man who would steal a timber claim would certainly steal a cash box if he found one. To whoever lifts this floor and finds what I have left, I do not know who you are or what has brought you here, but if you have come this far and bought this land and opened this cellar, then I believe you are someone who is starting something rather than ending something. That is a good kind of person. Use the money to fix what is broken and plant what can be grown and make this cabin a working place again. The forest around it is honest timber, and the soil in the kitchen garden will grow anything you put care into, and the creek runs clean. I was happy here, not in every year, not without difficulty, but in the way that matters, the happiness of knowing what you are doing and doing it well, in a place that is exactly what it appears to be. This land never lied to me. I hope it will not lie to you either. Aldous Vance, in his own hand, November 1903, by lantern light at the end of a long season. Delia read the letter twice. On the second reading, she set it down on the workbench and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and held very still. She did not cry dramatically. She cried the way a person cries when something they have been carrying a long distance is finally allowed to be heavy, quietly, and with a relief that doesn't have words attached to it, only the feeling of something releasing. She did not spend the gold all at once. She had never had money of any significant amount, and she understood instinctively that the value of money is not in the single large purchase, but in the series of smaller decisions that determine what something actually becomes. She went to Olin Pickett's store the following morning and bought lumber nails, a draw knife, a caulking iron, a box of candles, 6 feet of oilcloth, and a sack of oats and a sack of dried peas. And she paid with one of the gold coins and received her change carefully, and carried it all back up the creek road in 2 loads. She told Olin about the cabin, not about the gold, not about the letter, only about the roof and the floor and what she intended to do. He listened without comment, then said there was a man named Ed Tremblay who lived 3 miles south on the creek road and had been a timber framer before a fall on a log drive had ended the heavy work, but who still did carpentry when his hip allowed. You might ask him about the roof framing. He'll tell you if it's worth repairing or better to come down and start over. Ed Tremblay was 58, with a French-Canadian accent that got thicker when he was concentrating, and hands that moved over wood the way a blind man reads a page, by touch, by memory, by something that went below the level of thought. He came to the property on a gray morning, walked through the cabin without saying much, looked at the rafter assembly on the north side, then went outside and stood in the yard, looking at the collapsed south portion for a long time. he said. "The bones are good. Rafters are full-dimension spruce, 2 inches by 6, not dressed. Whoever built this built it to last." He paused. "South side, the purlins let go and took the sheathing with it. You'll need to sister the damaged rafters and relay the whole south face. Cedar again, if you can get it. Maybe 300 board feet, maybe a little more." She told him she would be the second set of hands. He looked at her the way Olin Pickett had looked at her, and then he said, "Monday then, early." They started early Monday. Ed showed her how to work the damaged sections safely, shoring the exposed rafter tails before removing anything, so the structure didn't shift, and then how to strip the ruined sheathing board by board, working from the eave up. He showed her how to cut replacement planks to match the originals, how to sister a rafter with half-lapped joints, so the join was stronger than the original member, how to lay cedar shingles in proper offset courses with the correct exposure, driving each pair of nails just below the butt of the shingle above so the nail heads would be protected from weather. They worked on the roof for 9 days, and in those 9 days, she learned things about Ed Tremblay, that he had come down from Abitibi at 20, speaking almost no English, and had learned timber framing by watching and then doing, and then being corrected and then doing again, which he said was the only honest way to learn a physical skill, that he had a daughter in North Bay he was proud of, in a way that made him go quiet when he mentioned it. The kind of quiet that contains more than it lets out, that he kept a folded paper in his breast pocket with the floor plan of a house he had designed and never built, and that he had been carrying it for 11 years. On the 4th day, a woman named Ruth Stanger appeared at the property with a pot of baked beans and a loaf of bread she had wrapped in a piece of toweling. Ruth was 50, the wife of a hay and grain farmer named Otto Stanger, who worked land 2 miles down the creek road, and she had the particular directness of a woman who has spent decades getting things done without waiting to be asked. She set the pot on the cabin's hearth. Delia had the fire going by then and said, "Ed's wife told me there was a young woman up here working the old Vance camp. I thought you might appreciate something hot." She did not wait for thanks. She came back 2 days later with a crock of pickled cabbage and a jar of rendered lard. The day after that, she brought her husband Otto, who was 62, broad-shouldered, unhurried, and spoke almost entirely in observations rather than questions. He looked at the alderbrush filling the old kitchen garden and said, "I could bring the horses and pull that brush in an afternoon if you want to get that ground turned before it freezes hard again." He pulled it in less than that. The soil underneath was exactly what Delia had hoped. Dark, loose, river-bottom loam that smelled of iron and organic matter. She seeded it to winter rye that same evening, raking the seed into the surface in rows as straight as she could make them in the remaining light. A man named Hadley Pope, who ran a small trapline east of the creek road and had spent 30 winters in the bush country, brought her a cord of cut birch stacked against the lean-to wall and refused payment. He said only that Aldous Vance had taught him to identify timber species and how to fell safely, and that a cord of wood was nothing against what that knowledge had been worth. Each person who came brought something specific and left without requiring ceremony, and Delia began to understand that this was not generosity in the sense she had been taught to recognize it, the formal kind, announced and grateful, but something older, a pattern of maintenance. Neighbor to neighbor, that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the understanding that the boreal country is hard enough without people making it harder for each other. Every person who came was paying a debt to something she had not caused and could not name, but had somehow, by arriving here and choosing to stay and work, made herself the current address of. The weeks moved into months. She replaced the 6 rotten floor planks with cedar she bought at the carver's landing mill, cutting each one to fit with the draw knife Bess Quennell's chisel and her father's hewing axe, working them smooth. She rechunked the gaps between the cabin logs with a mixture of oakum and lime mortar, working from the top down so the new chinking could cure undisturbed. She rebuilt the lean-to door from split cedar planks and fitted it with hinges she forged herself from strap iron. Using a small forge, she built against the lean-to's back wall from flat fieldstone and a bellows made from scrapboard, and a piece of moosehide she traded a jar of pickled beans for from a Cree family camped 2 miles up the creek. She cleared the path to the spring and fitted it with a timber frame and a lidded cover to keep the wildlife out. She built a proper woodshed against the north wall of the cabin and split 3 cords of birch for the coming winter. Using her father's axe and a splitting maul, she found rusting in the lean-to's corner, which she cleaned and rehung with a new ash handle she shaped herself. She found, behind the cabin in a hollow spruce, a wild bee colony. And she built a hive box from cedar scraps and spent a careful afternoon transferring the colony using a smoked birch brand and her bare hands. Because she had no veil, and her father had always said that bees were one of the few things that responded better to calm than to protection. By November, the cabin was weather-tight. By December, it was warm in a way that the $11 cabin had not been in 9 years. A functional, bone-deep warmth that came from a well-drawn chimney and seasoned wood and a building that no longer had gaps where the cold could get in. She began filing saws again. She had bought a set of mill files from Olin Pickett, and the word moved through the area the way word moves in rural places, quietly, from one person to the next, without announcement. The bush operators and the small mill managers began sending their saws to her. She worked at the lean-to bench, clamping each blade in a wooden vise she built from spruce, working the files in the consistent angled strokes her father had shown her, setting the teeth with a small punch and hammer, testing the tension by ear. She charged a fair rate and turned the work quickly and handled the blades as though they mattered to her, which they did. She saved what she did not need, not dramatically, not in large amounts, a little from each job, the way a northern river accumulates itself from 100 small sources that individually seem too small to matter. She was not comfortable in the way that word is used to mean ease. She worked hard, and she was sometimes cold, and the loneliness of the first winter was a real thing. Not a gentle ache, but a solid presence in the cabin. On the evenings when the wind came from the north, and the temperature dropped past 20 below, and the only sound was the fire and the settling of the logs. But she was doing what she knew how to do, in a place she had chosen, with her own tools in her own hands. And that was a different category of feeling from comfort. It was something more like integrity, the specific satisfaction of a life arranged according to its own logic rather than someone else's. In the spring, she planted the kitchen garden in earnest. Potatoes and turnips and carrots and onion sets in the frost-resistant lower rows, beans and squash and summer herbs along the south-facing edge where the warming was earliest. She watered it from the spring with a wooden trough she built from boards and tin sheet. Gravity fed down the slope to the garden edge. She watched it grow with the attention of someone who has come to understand that a garden is less a thing than a conversation you are having. With the soil, and the light, and the particular character of the season. And that your most important contribution to that conversation is patience. Ruth Stanger came by every Tuesday now, or sent something with Otto when he passed on his way to Carver's Landing. A jar of preserves, a sack of seed potatoes. Once, a copy of a homesteading manual published in Guelph that was 30 years old and, she said, 3 recipes for sauerkraut that actually worked, and about 40 that were optimistic. Hadley Pope stopped in whenever he passed, which was often, and drank tea at the lean-to bench and talked about the weather and the animals and the state of the trap lines with the easy brevity of someone who has spent enough time alone to know the value of saying exactly what you mean and no more. Ed Tremblay came by in the spring to look at the roof, declared it sound, and stayed for dinner. People in Carver's Landing knew her name now. Olin Pickett kept a running account for her at the store. The Cree family upriver sent their youngest son to her with a broken crosscut, saw that she repaired in an afternoon, and sent back with no charge. Because Bess Quennell's notebook had an entry about the family, who showed her where the best marsh plants grew, and she considered the book a standing line of credit in that particular direction. One evening in late June, when the light lasted past 9 o'clock, and the air was warm and carried the smell of balsam and the creek and the particular sweetness of wild roses coming into bloom along the road edge, Delia sat in the cabin in the chair that Ed Tremblay had made for her as a spring gift. A proper settle, with a high back and a woven seat of basswood splints, more comfortable than anything you would expect from its plain appearance. And she looked at the objects arranged on the shelf above the fireplace. Aldous Vance's letter, folded in its original thirds and set in the birchwood case beside the brass compass, needle still pointed north. Bess Quennell's field notebook, cover worn soft with handling. Her father's hewing axe, head up, leaning against the stone chimney where the light caught the polished bevel of the blade. 4 objects that had not come from the same life and had never been in the same room until now. A letter from a man she would never meet, who had trusted the cabin to whoever came next. A notebook from a woman who had taught her that skill was the only inheritance that could not be argued over. An axe from a father who had believed, without making a large statement about it, that she was worth teaching. She thought about Aldous Vance, who had built this cabin well and lost most of what he worked for, and had chosen, in the end, to leave what remained not to bitterness, but to the possibility of whoever came next. She thought about Bess Quennell, who had lived on other people's land her whole life, and who had tried, in the time she had with Delia, to give her the tools that would mean she never had to. She thought about her father, Harold Marsh, who had given her an axe and told her it was the most honest tool he owned, and who had been right about that, and right about her. She thought about her mother, Vera, who had been afraid and tired, and had let Clifton Albury make a decision that was not his to make. She found she could hold that thought now, without the same weight it had carried in October. Not without sadness, but without the acute edge of it. She did not think about Clifton Albury. He had earned exactly the amount of her attention he deserved, which was none. She looked at the fire, low in the wide-mouthed firebox, and at the walls she had rechunked and replastered, and at the floor she had repaired plank by plank, and at the window she had reglazed herself with glass ordered from Sudbury, set in a putty made from linseed oil and chalk the way Bess had taught her. And she thought of the man who had built this cabin in the summer of 1888, and who had written, at the end of a very long season, that this land had never lied to him. She picked up the compass from the birch case and held it in her palm. The needle swung once and settled, precise and unhurried, pointing north. Joseph Makwa had told Aldous Vance that the compass would always point true north, but that it was up to him to decide what he was walking toward. Delia set it back on the shelf, carefully, with both hands. Outside, the creek ran over stones in the early summer dark. A thrush sang somewhere in the spruce above the garden, the same four-note phrase repeated and slightly varied, the way a person works at something they are genuinely trying to get right. The smell of the balsam came through the open window. The fire ticked in the chimney. She had been 22 years old when she was turned out of the only house she had ever lived in, with $11 in an envelope and a note that told her not to return. She had walked north, because north was where the country stopped asking you who your people were, and started asking what you could do. She had bought 40 acres of boreal forest, and a cabin with a cold cellar, and an honest spring, and a fireplace wide enough to keep a person warm through a northern winter. She had spent the $11 that were meant to close a chapter on the first page of one she was writing herself, and beneath the floor of that cold cellar, she had found a letter from a man who had also lost something, and had chosen to leave what remained as an act of faith in the person who came next, whoever they were, whenever they came. He had trusted the land to carry it forward. The land had. We at Cabin Stories don't know what Aldous Vance would have made of Delia Marsh, or whether he would have recognized, in her, the particular kind of person he had hoped would come. But we think he would have been glad that she was the one who lifted that floor. It was the best $11 she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And we'd like to ask you something before you go. Is there a place in your own life, a skill you were given, a thing you were trusted with, a door you almost didn't open, that turned out to be the beginning of something? We'd really like to know. Tell us in the comments.